Now they say the oldest grave here is 1833. That's the oldest recorded. They've got a bunch over the hill where the dates have worn off.
Look at this opulent marker up here with the little windows on it.
Where?
And the angel on top.
Oh yeah. That's a good one. I got a great picture of that. Sure, man. Shoot the picture with the cloudy sky behind it. So you're getting close to some real good. There's a statue right up there.
Or that tree that's made out of branch.
Oh man, there's a snake down there.
Yeah, all of it.
Hi. Good. We wanted to see the Davis.
Right here, perfect. Right here. Perfect.
That's my brother's family. Right here.
My name is William H. Davis. I am best known as an educator. I was born here in the Valley back in November 27th of 1848. And I lived in Columbus and in Cincinnati until I was 15 years old. And during that time, I attended public school. And while I was in public school, I really enjoyed it. I just really got into it, and I mastered the English language and mastered the art of education. Well, in December of 1863, I enlisted in the independent order in Ohio, known as the Light Guard. And we were to protect and be a bodyguard for the president and for several government buildings around in the DC area. I was one of 4 blacks in Columbus that joined that garrison at the time, and the 4 of us joined as cooks. And we were the only blacks in the regiment. Well, early in the months of 1865, I was discharged because I had an ear problem. Back in those early days, early black education was developed through a combination of forces such as self-help efforts, a few benevolent white people, and the support of the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau. These were free black men that would get together to try to stimulate black education. Now, during this time, there was very little support for the black schools. So black schools were normally set up in someone's house or church, and they would be set up with 4, 5, maybe 10 children. But it was totally unsupported. Although in 1863, the schools were set up and said that the black schools would be legitimate and they would be separate but equal. Well, we know how that worked. There were places where the schools were set up in people's homes and churches. And about this time, in a place called Tinkersville. You know where that is? Come on. Tinkersville. Malden.
Ah.
And there was a gentleman there named Reverend Rice. They called him Father Rice. And that was because he was known by the early Negroes in the state because he was a persistent effort in their religion and their educational pursuits. Now, Father Rice is buried right down there. Father Rice and I became very good friends, and it was because of Father Rice he encouraged me to leave the boat and come and work for him. Well, the school was small, it was in his house, and every morning we had to go and we had to unmake his bed, put the chairs in the house and the table so he could teach the children, well, I could teach the children, and then in the evening we'd have to reverse the process, put his house back together and put the chairs back. It was a beginning of trying to form an educational system for black children. Well, in 69, I married Hallie Ann Lewis. Hallie is right there. And when I did that, I then had to walk every day 6 miles. It's 12 miles round trip, 60 miles a week to come to school, to teach, because it was my duty. And even though it was treacherous, I did it every day. And that was the time in which I met the young Booker T. Washington. Booker T was he was a young, energetic kid. He loved school. The boy just raved of, he loved to learn. And I took my efforts to teach him. I taught him after school, did tutoring sessions, tried to bring different things to him. I took a special interest in him because of his willing to learn. Now, I learned later on in 1937 that Booker T. Washington addressed the people, and this was when they named the college the Tuskegee Institute. He said that it was because of my efforts to teach him and encourage him that he became the person that he was on that day. Now, one of the things that I did at that time was I separated my older students from the younger students and called that the secondary school. The only white person that was even greatly interested in it all was General Ruffner. Some of his relatives are right over there. A bunch of Ruffners all around, but they were, I guess you would call them some of the early integrationalists, maybe, because they had an interest in the black community and the black students. They felt that they needed to be educated and be equal along with everyone else. Even though there wasn't a lot of support and people thought that it was a failure, I can tell you that it wasn't. Because one, we had many educators that graduated from Tuskegee Institute, including Booker T. Washington, who was a great orator, inventor and all. But one person that people don't know about was Daniel Chappie James. Daniel Chappie James was the first African American to become a general in the United States Armed Forces. He was also the last Tuskegee Airman. He taught the Tuskegee Airmen. He made his fame in Korea as an ace, and he and his wingman, Robin Olds, were notoriously known over the skies of Vietnam as Black Men and Robin. So that lets me know that the efforts that I put forth as a teacher to teach Booker T. Washington, he taught others, and they have taught others, and they have gone on to be famous. It let me know that my mission was a success. In 1871, I was put in charge and chosen to be the superintendent of the Board of Education of Charleston, where I was that leader for 24 years. And even further than that, in 1888, because of my reputation and impact on education and social events, an unexpected event took place. I was nominated by a delegation of 49 African Americans in the state of West Virginia that were the freedmen of the African Americans in the Valley. And they supported me for a run as governor. To this day, I am the only African American that has ever run for a position of governor in the state of West Virginia. And one thing that I am most proud of, that even today, many of my practices dealing with the secondary school system are still in force because of my implementation.
Made a movie here in West Virginia. Awesome. And it was a silent film called The Key to Power, and it was made in 1918, and it has it's a love story and an adventure, and it involves World War I and intrigue and the war effort, and it's interviewed a lot of coal miners to make the movie, and it premiered here in Charleston. And then about 10 years later, I made a documentary short about Theodore Roosevelt and his trip in the Amazon forest down the River of Doubt, which is now named Rio Roosevelt. And I was asked by the Roosevelt family to put together this documentary film from footage that was obtained during that trip and a second subsequent trip after Roosevelt passed away, to honor some of his conservation and his adventurous spirit. So those are the two films that I am known for, that you would find my name on the Internet Movie Database. I was born in Peytona in Boone County, which is now Boone County. It was Kanawha County at the time, in 1870, and I died here in Charleston in 1939 of pneumonia. So the niece of John Edward Kenna, who was a U.S. Senator from West Virginia, who is one of the two statues from West Virginia in Statuary Hall at the United States Capitol. And they believe he was such a rising star in political circles that he could have been the first Roman Catholic president before John F. Kennedy. He was well before that time, but he died of a pulmonary embolism in his 40s, and that ended that. But his political aspirations allowed the rest of the family to experience some culture and education that the average southern West Virginia woman would not have been able to pursue. I went to finishing school in Washington, D.C. and met a lot of people as a result of that, which allowed me my career in Hollywood. And also, I was almost 50 years old when I made the first movie, The Key to Power. So I did that, and then 10 years later made another movie. So it wasn't all just right out of the gate. You know, at that time, for a woman to be making movies, and at the age I was at that time, was rather unusual, and I lived to an older age than a lot of people did at that time, so I had a blessed life. Like the second trip that was taken down Rio Roosevelt was undertaken after Roosevelt passed away, and so she would have had to have gone through the old footage from the mid-19-teens and, you know, tried to figure out what other film they could get when they went down the second time. She didn't go on the trip, but she would have, you know, tried to help direct what they got that time around.
Can you repeat the two main movies again? I'm sorry.
The Key to Power and The River of Doubt.
Thank you.
And the working title for The Key to Power was called The Romance of Coal.
You might be the brightest, smartest, most talented Jewish boy, but that may only mean you're the most smartest, brightest, talented brush pusher, or peddler, or day laborer, or something along those lines. Some places they limited the number of Jewish weddings. This was an attempt to keep Jewish births down. That way, authorities sometimes have an interesting, take too much of an interest, I think, in Jewish life, especially daily life. My brother Philip and I were luckier than some. We came from a good family. We had some means, and we were educated. We'd gone to good schools. But in 1857, we decided that our opportunities in Europe were limited, and we decided to head west like so many else were doing. America was calling, it was an opportunity. So in France, we hopped on a ship and went to New York. We stayed in New York for a year, worked in the textile and garment industry. Kind of got used to the trade, learned a few things, but we moved to Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, I wasn't happy, so I moved on to Iowa seeking my fortune. Iowa didn't stick, so in 1860 I came to Charleston, Virginia. Opened a small store that also sold clothes. I did well. People didn't seem to mind buying pants from a Bavarian Jew. After a few months, I convinced my brother Philip to move from Pittsburgh to Charleston, which he did. 1861, however, was a difficult time, and the country was tearing itself apart. There were those who wanted to preserve the Union, who believed that the peace and prosperity that being part of the United States, this was an important thing, and we should save it. My brother and I were not unused to chance. We'd taken a chance at coming across the ocean. We'd taken a chance in leaving Europe. The United States of America had been good to us, so we supported the Union. We supported Abraham Lincoln, and we were jailed. We spent 3 months in jail. They took our money, they took our property. At the end of 3 months, they let us loose. They didn't give us back our money. Shortly thereafter, however, the city, which had been under the influence of the Confederates, fell into the hands of the Union Army, where it was occupied for the remainder of the war. My brother and I had almost essentially to start over, but slowly but surely, we were able to rebuild our fortunes. And then when the war was finally over, whew, there was money to be made. The hills were full of coal, and there was lumber, and they could drill into the ground and bring up salt. I made money hand over fist, but I never turned a shovel, I never picked up an axe, and I didn't drill anything. I sold clothes. I sold work clothes. I sold fine linens. I sold coats for winter. I sold summer dresses. I sold socks, hosiery, underwear, hats, shoes, whatever you wanted to put on your back, I sold it and did very well. I took this money and invested it back in my community. I bought land. I bought old houses, fixed them up, and rented them out. I did very well. Got involved with city politics. Most of the problems that had happened before were largely forgotten. Largely. I've been alone for a long time. I was deep into middle age and hadn't married. I started looking around. It was time to start a family, I thought. So I found Fanny Ellinger. She and her family had immigrated from Munich to Kentucky. We had a whirlwind romance, and I convinced her to move back to Charleston with me. We were married in 1873. Kind of an impetuous move. We were an older couple. I was 38, she was 21. We had 8 children together. I stepped away, focused more on my family, and I focused on my investments, and also focused on politics. As I said, I was with the city council, but then I got involved with state politics, and I found myself being asked to stand as treasurer. So I ran for election for state treasurer. I was a successful businessman. I had money. I had a prominent reputation. I was a good Republican. I lost. Part of me thinks it might have to do with people being okay with purchasing pants from a Bavarian Jew, but not being so happy about giving them his tax money. It could also be more realistically that the phrase State Treasurer Moses Frankenberger is an awfully long thing to have to say. It doesn't really roll off the tongue. Neither also does Bank President Moses Frankenberger. I helped to start the Citizens Bank. It started off as a local bank, a state bank, but after a year, it went national. I was president for the first year. I was also its chief stockholder. Then after the first year, I decided to step down and someone else became president. My brother and I were Masons, not entirely unheard of, but a little unusual for the time. My wife and I gave generously to the city. We helped to build the Jewish temple, and we gave money to the Christians to build their houses of worship. Protestant, Catholic, didn't matter. God had been very good to Fanny and me. And my thought was that God had been very good to Charleston. And that if the people of Charleston wanted to build houses of worship, that this was a good thing. This would delight the Lord, and this would also keep people out of trouble on Sunday mornings. I did manage to live to see the start of the new century. I died in 1902. My store moved on without me. It started off as a building that was on a dirt road overlooking the river. It moved over to a building that's on Capitol and Virginia Street. There was a bank in there, the Kanawha National Bank, but it didn't survive the Great Depression. Though you can go there and see ballet now. Charleston Ballet is located in that building. And next door you can buy something called Pilates. I hear they're delicious. Frankenbergers lasted for generations. It became a place that families would take their children at the beginning of the year to outfit them for school. It was a place to get your winter clothes. It was a place to get your swimsuit or your shoes or your hat or whatever you needed. But clothing stores aren't eternal. It passed away in 1983 after 123 years, which was pretty elderly for a clothing store. The name Frankenberger really isn't eternal either. If you look around the streets of Charleston, you're hard-pressed to find a street named Frankenberger or an avenue named Frankenberger. But Fanny and Philip and I didn't come to Charleston to have streets named after us. We came for opportunity, for freedom, which we found minus those 3 months, but what's a little jail time among friends? What I will say in closing is the thing that I know most about Charleston is that it's a place you can come and do almost anything because they don't know to tell you not to. Thank you very much for visiting with me today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Good afternoon. It is good to have visitors. It's always good to have visitors here, especially on occasions like this. I am Judge James H. Brown. You may or may not know me, but you see that large monument, which resembles a monument in the nation's capital, I'm told. That monument is the largest in the cemetery, and it sits just adjacent to my final resting place, along with my wives and family members, which then stretch from that monument down the hillside to your left, almost to the street. You'll see many Browns interred here along with me, so I'm not lonely, even when days when no one's here. It is rumored by some of my descendants that in bringing that monument up the hill, which is of course an impressive feat in the late 1800s, it took a team of 12 horses on a wagon and many strong men to bring it up. And the cost, as was relayed a little earlier, today's money, about $500,000. An adventure well lived, as I hope to relate to you about what he did. If you haven't heard of him, as I had not, he's an amazing individual. And I'm going to stop talking in the third person and greet you in the first person. The Honorable Okie Johnson, who was a fellow jurist of mine, was kind enough to write this pamphlet on the occasion of my passing. And he quoted Mark Antony, "The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones." But it would be nearer to the truth to say the good that men do lives after them, the evil is oft interred with their bones, which is very kind, Judge Okie. I was born in Cabell County, Virginia, of course, now West Virginia, on Christmas Day. So I was a Christmas gift to the Appalachians in 1818. My father, Dr. Benjamin Brown, of course, hailed from the mother state, Virginia, Prince William County, to where Huntington now stands in 1805. His ancestors have lived in that county since the mid-1600s, 1636. And if you remember your geography and history at that time, that was the West. It was not a state on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. That was the farthest west of many colonies in this area, so it was a wild country. He attended Marietta College, Judge Brown did, but he grew ill and left college, recovered, and then attended Augusta College in Kentucky and graduated in 1840. He then began reading law, practicing law with a lawyer, but not yet entering the bar in 1842 with the John Laidley of Cabell County, admitted to the bar then a year later, and practiced in the circuit. And it was a rather large circuit. You have to remember the transportation at the time, but I practiced in Cabell, Wayne, Logan, Mason, Jackson, and Kanawha counties in the federal and appellate courts. So imagine traveling to those areas on a regular circuit and a basis, hearing cases. It's not like hopping in your vehicle today and driving around. It took days and days of travel in all sorts of weather to make sure that they arrived on the bench to preside. In 1848, he moved eastward, but not too far, to here in Kanawha County, and entered into one of the strongest bars in the state of Virginia. At that time, it was led by Colonel H.H. Smith, the silver-tongued orator of Virginia, he was called. And quite an example he set for me. From 1848 to 1852, I was in partnership in the practice of law with the late J.W. Laidley, Esquire, and afterwards with others. And shortly after my admission to the bar, I made what some would say was a mistake, but others would say is a calling. I entered the political field and had some success, taking active interest in public affairs. In the winter of 1854, I was a delegate to the Democratic State Convention, and had an honor of nominating Harry Wise for the governorship of Virginia. The man who in the campaign that followed in his terrible and merciless expose of know-nothingism gave that oath-bound political organization its death wounds. In the winter of 1856, I was a delegate again to the Congressional Convention in Parkersburg that nominated A.G. Jenkins. I was a delegate to the convention in Parkersburg that nominated John Carlisle for Congress. Then the war, of course, came on. And
a hero came to a parting of the ways. Political organizations were to be broken up, and while I was an ardent Democrat by inheritance and conviction and a strong states' rights man, I never believed in succession, but I came to believe in secession, and had a parting of the ways, you would imagine, with some of my friends. The convention was called by the people of West Virginia to meet in Wheeling in the latter part of May 1861. The convention met, and the government of Virginia was restored with its capital at Wheeling, with its governor and all the state officers. This was a separate government from Virginia. It was to rule over the western part of the state. Of course, the people in Richmond and other places did not take kindly to that. They wanted one rule. The Constitutional Convention was called for the purpose of forming a new state in just a very short period of time. And I was a member of this convention and helped form the Constitution of the new state of West Virginia. Of course, it required the consent of Virginia, the new state, and Congress before it could be admitted. Virginia gave her consent by the restored government in Wheeling. On the 14th of January, 1862, I resigned my seat in the legislature to take effect on the 24th of that month, and I became a judge. It involved travel and often had to be protected and surrounded by military forces at the time. At one time, while holding court in Point Pleasant in Mason County, the Confederate cavalry came upon us. To escape capture, I was compelled to flee across the Ohio River under heavy fire, but yet still maintained my rounds. More than once, I had to avoid the enemy by flight, so court sometimes adjourned very quickly. In June of 1863, of course, the state was chartered. June 20th, 1863, West Virginia became the 35th state of the Union by the blessing of our father and the providence of Abraham Lincoln. And the new state had to have its judiciary, and I was honored to be a part of that. I was one of the first judges of the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, which I was elected on the 28th day of May, 1863. I held office for 8 years until the term expired. I was re-nominated for the office, but fortunes had changed politically in the area, and my party was not quite in favor as it was earlier, and I was defeated in my re-election attempts. In 1875, I was the caucus nominee of this party for U.S. Senator, but again, with the party being in the minority, I did not find success. Very little established law in West Virginia. They were actually creating it as they were going. So there were many, many instances of possibilities for error. And yet, in every decision he made, sometimes under fire from enemy forces, never overturned. So he went undefeated, which is a pretty big accomplishment for a judge. I've been 8 children. I was twice married. There are still my descendants who live in the city of Charleston today. And you may run into some of them today. I was very fortunate to see some of my descendants last year as they stopped by to see how the old judge was doing. I knew nothing about him, so I have to admit my ignorance. But he's not given the acclaim I think he deserves. This guy was just instrumental in not only forming the city of Charleston and what we would become, but also the state. And then sitting on the bench of the Supreme Court for 8 years and throughout his career, which had started, of course, years earlier, never being overturned on any decision he made, not missing court appearances, even under the imminent threat of death. Cut from a different cloth. And we're lucky to have men like that who have guided and brought us to where we are. He somehow found a way to maintain dignity and honor the law, even at a time when half of the country was trying to establish its own laws and break away and form its new nation. But he switched parties, he lost friends. It was a bitter parting of ways. As you would imagine, tempers were very hot. People didn't agree with his decision. They thought he should stay with the Commonwealth and thus with the South. He disagreed. He was a big supporter of states' rights, but there was a line he would not cross. I won't put words in his mouth, but obviously the issues of the day led him to believe whatever he believed to make the decision he made. And so you can talk about states' rights, you can talk about taxes, you can talk about a lot of things, but of course slavery was one of the major issues of the day. And history will judge that he made the right decision.